is another island called Pentecost. And we heard that on that island an even more spectacular ceremony was to take place, one of the most spectacular of all ceremonies of the South Seas. So we sailed across the narrow strait in a canoe and came to a long silver sand beach, and there we camped. We had no difficulty in finding out where the ceremony was to take place, because people who were preparing for it passed us all day long carrying bundles of vines. All we had to do was to follow them. Only half a mile from the coast, we came to a clearing in the forest. It was on a steep hillside, and there, at the head of it, stood the half-built tower. Already, it was over 60 feet high, and several more stories were yet to be added to the top. The men had been working on it for nearly a fortnight, and it would take another 3 days of work before it would be complete. At the base of the tower, the clearing was being enlarged to provide a landing ground for the jumpers. The stumps, too, had to be dug up so that a falling diver wouldn't brain himself on them. The tower was now so high that although it had been built around a lopped tree which had been left standing, the top parts of it had to be guyed with vines to stop the whole construction from toppling. Each jumper will dive from a separate platform which has to be built projecting from the front of the tower. I had imagined that every man who was going to jump would supervise the construction of his own platform to make sure that it was built correctly and safely. But in fact, this wasn't the case. Everybody helped with the work. When the platforms were complete, each one of them was carefully covered with banana leaves to prevent it from becoming wet and slippery if there were a rainstorm before the time for the ceremony arrived. Looking down from the topmost point of the tower, the tiny, doll-like figures on the ground seemed a very, very long way away. Now came the last stage of the preparations, the cutting of the vines which will be tied around the ankles of each diver. These vines dangle from the branches of almost every tree, as they do in all tropical forests. But the Pentecost men were very particular as to which sort they cut, for only one kind is sufficiently strong and sufficiently pliable to be used in the ceremony. This particular vine is too thick at the base to serve as a jumping rope, but the man has cut it for the sake of the thinner top section. The vines must be cut exactly 1 day before the ceremony takes place. If they're cut earlier, they dry out, lose their natural elasticity and strength, and may break when they're finally used in the jumping. Nearly all the men who had been working on the tower were in the forest occupied with this task, for there were to be 25 jumpers, each of whom would require 2 vines, 1 for each ankle, so that all in all, 5,000 feet of vine had to be gathered. They were hung in pairs from each platform, so that they dangled freely down the front of the tower. They had to be accurately measured for length, for if they were too long, then the diver would hit the ground at full speed and probably kill himself. And if they were too short, then he would be left suspended in midair. But the assessment of their length is not easy, for not only will the twisted, curling vines stretch considerably under the strain of the jump, but the platforms are so made that they will collapse and hinge downwards as the vines tighten, thereby acting as additional shock absorbers. All this must be allowed for in measuring them. Lastly, the ends of the vines were frayed to make them pliable so that they could be securely tied around the diver's ankles. The ground at the base of the tower was given a final digging to make it soft. When the men went home that evening, all was complete. The tasseled ends of the vines had been carefully bundled in a wrapping of leaves. Soft stems of banana palms had been tied to the bottom timbers of the tower to cushion them in case a diver should swing and crash against them. The vines hung free like a monstrous shock of hair, and the tower stood deserted and silent in the forest, 100 feet high. After a fortnight of preparation, all was ready. The ceremony would start the next morning. Soon after dawn the following day, the festival began. Many of these people had come from the interior of the island, many hours' march distant. At least 20 of them will jump before the end of the day. All of them danced back and forth on a specially cleared space behind the tower, some carrying the scarlet leaves of the sacred croton plant. Almost immediately, a young boy, together with his 2 assistants, climbed into the tower to take up his position for the first dive. He was going to jump from one of the lowest platforms, yet even so, he would be over 40 feet from the ground. His helpers pulled up the vines that were to be fastened round his ankles. Clutching the red croton leaves in his hand, he walked forward to face his trial of courage. Without a pause, a second diver left the ranks of the dancers. One after another they dive, each man jumping from a platform higher up the tower. Every diver takes with him a relative who carries a sprig of leaves which give an extremely painful sting. Should the courage of the diver show signs of failing, his relative, standing behind him, will thrash himself with these stinging leaves, crying out with pain until the man is shamed into jumping. By midday, men were diving from over 70 feet, but with each successive jump, the strain on the vines becomes greater and the danger of their breaking more likely. Both the vines had broken, yet miraculously, the jumper himself was uninjured. If a man, having undertaken to jump, refuses to do so at the last moment, the shame on him and his family is immense, and he will have to pay the community a fine of many pigs to remove the blot from his character. Now, at last, the climax of the whole festival approached. This man, climbing the tower, will jump from the topmost platform, 100 feet above the ground.
la